Our next speaker is Tzviya Siegman. She is Wiley's Information Standards Lead. And one of the things that the NISO Education Committee was very interested in hearing about was a talk about building accessibility into long-form content. Many institutions are faced with the challenge that they can't buy something that hasn't been made appropriately accessible. So we were very fortunate to be able to bring in Tzviya to talk to us today about creating accessible content. Tzviya, you're unmuted. We've got your slides up. The podium is yours.
Thank you, and thank you very much for having me today. Can you hear me clearly?
We can. Great. You're good.
Okay. All right, so let's get started. As Jill said, I'm going to talk about creating accessible content today. Most of what I'm talking about today is applicable to any content, not just long-form content, but I'll touch on a few points that are relevant, especially to long-form content. As Jill mentioned, I work for Wiley. I'm the Information Standards Lead. My knowledge of accessibility comes primarily from working on the EPUB specification and my work with the World Wide Web Consortium. I've worked on some of the specifications that the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, produces, including the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines and the ARIA specifications. If you haven't heard about those in the past, I'll get into some details about what those are later on in the deck. And I seem to be having some trouble advancing my slides. Okay, here we go. So let's talk a little bit about what we'll cover today. I'll give a working definition of accessibility. I'll talk about the business, social, and legal reasons that we should consider for why to incorporate accessibility into our workflows and our content, as well as our platforms. I'll talk about how to get started with accessibility. It can be a little bit overwhelming to consider. And I'll get into some details about resources and tooling for accessibility. So I'm going to provide a basic definition for accessibility, which I've taken from the Web Accessibility Initiative's Introduction to Web Accessibility. The Web Accessibility Initiative is made up of many different groups. Web accessibility means that people with disabilities can use the web. More specifically, web accessibility means that people with disabilities can perceive, understand, navigate, and interact with the web, and that they can contribute to the web. Web accessibility also benefits others, including older people with changing abilities due to aging. So I'll build this out a little bit. Web accessibility, and really any accessibility, means that any person can use the web or the content that you're creating. This is really an extension of the vision of the web, that the web is usable by all. We take advantage of this concept in promoting the idea that the web is made for everybody. For the most part, the web is free. Some people have different opinions about concepts like open access, but we don't really dispute the idea that the web is useful for everybody. And everybody includes people with disabilities. And often we think of disabilities as only things like blindness or people in wheelchairs, but often this includes people who have issues with vision. Many of us wear glasses. If you take your glasses off, perhaps you can't see a website, but you may be able to adjust the font size on your screen, and then perhaps you'll be able to read something even without your glasses. And we'll get into a more detailed definition of situational disabilities or temporary disabilities shortly. So let's talk about why accessibility matters. And you'll see that I have the shorthand A11Y there. If you get into the world of accessibility, you might hear people talking about ally or A11Y, and it's not a very accessible term. But it's the shorthand that we all use. There are 11 letters between A and Y, and it's a lot easier to type that than it is to type out accessibility and perhaps spell it wrong. And we just have adopted that shorthand. It's called a numeronym. There are a few others out there. Also, I18N is shorthand for internationalization, and people have just started using it, and it's even worked its way into some company names. But now you know, and you can stop wondering what all these people are talking about. So it's considered a social responsibility to provide equal opportunity. And these are probably some words you're familiar with from other parts of your life or your work. Providing equal opportunity is something that we have to do in general. There are many overlaps with other issues that you've encountered. The digital divide and the way that we provide accessible content often overlaps. Issues with broadband, issues with poor internet access. People who don't necessarily have the latest technologies often benefit from accessible content because of the way that simplified content or accessible content, which are not always the same thing, can be provided. I mentioned people with situational disabilities before. A situational disability can be somebody who's in a blackout. Maybe I can't access my content in the way that I usually do because I don't have full electricity, and I need to be able to access my content in a different way. There are also many legal requirements, and I'm not going to get into the full details of all of the legal requirements, but it's important to be aware that there are many legal requirements. Many universities and libraries will not purchase content that's not accessible or proven to be accessible, sometimes by a third party. The Marrakesh Treaty, which was signed a few years ago, has led to revisions of laws like the Section 508 of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And it's important to be aware that the Americans with Disabilities Act says that websites and most electronic materials are places of public accommodation. And what is a place of public accommodation? That's exactly the same law that we have for sidewalks, that requires sidewalks to have things like curb cuts. And I'll just give you a few quick examples of some lawsuits that have happened recently. The one that's probably most similar to the content that most of us are familiar with, are really platforms, is the edX lawsuit. edX is a learning management system, and they were sued, and they had to revamp the entire site to make it accessible. In the last year or so, Domino's was sued, the pizza chain, because their website was not accessible. They had to revamp that. The Winn-Dixie supermarket had a similar lawsuit to Domino's, and they also had to redo their website. Hooters, the restaurant of fame or infamy, whatever you'd prefer, has two simultaneous lawsuits, one to make their website accessible and one to make sure that they are both updating and maintaining the accessibility of their website. The Hooters one is particularly notable because often publishers, for example, are asked to make their content accessible. And as long as they are putting forth the effort to make things accessible, it's accepted. But the Hooters one gives us an example of an organization that is putting forth the effort, but the second lawsuit shows that updating and maintaining is just as important. So we do need to talk about minimizing the legal risk. And here are just a few other examples of how widespread the legal obligation is. The Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities was signed by the General Assembly of the UN by more than 175 countries in 2018. The European Accessibility Act requires ATMs, banking services, TV equipment, and so on to be accessible, and that includes things like ebooks. And as I mentioned, in the US, there's an increasing number of legal actions pointing to the ADA. So who benefits from accessibility? So our common examples are people who are blind, deaf, low vision, dyslexic, people with learning disabilities, and many of people who fall into those categories require special tools such as assistive technologies. Many of us think of screen readers such as JAWS or VoiceOver that's available on iOS systems. There are also people with cognitive disabilities or neurological issues. People with a slow internet connection or older technologies and mobile devices. I think probably just about everybody joining us today has used a mobile device and encountered some sort of issue. Maybe you had a table that didn't rotate correctly, you encountered a PDF that just didn't size right for your screen. A lot of these would be addressed by some of the same issues that accessibility addresses. We have temporary disabilities. Perhaps you've broken an arm and you couldn't use one hand. Perhaps you've broken two arms and you were handless for a few weeks. Situational disabilities, a noisier dark room, closed captioning, was originally invented for people who could not hear the TV or whatever video they were watching. Many of us have benefited from closed captioning in a noisy bar or gym. There are many other circumstances like that. Many of us have benefited from Siri or similar voice assistants. Siri was also originally invented for people with disabilities. The aging population no doubt benefits from tools that were originally invented to be accessible. We've all zoomed in on our phones when we couldn't quite make out the text that somebody sent us. In other words, just about everybody benefits from tools for accessibility. The picture that I've put at the bottom of the screen is a curb cut. Curb cuts were, of course, implemented for people with wheelchairs. I have made use of curb cuts just last night to wheel my luggage out of the airport, to push my son in his stroller, and I'm sure just about all of us have taken advantage of these curb cuts. So what we learn from this is that while many things are done to make things more accessible for people with disabilities, in reality, they benefit just about the whole population. Another important point to realize is that accessibility is a spectrum. Content that is considered partially accessible is more useful than content that is not accessible at all. It's very hard to define what full accessibility is, because what might be accessible for a user who is blind will not necessarily be helpful for a user who is deaf. I've been working on a specification for audiobooks, and somebody said to me, what can we do to make this useful for somebody who's deaf? Which was not something I had considered before. But we should be doing what we can to make content as accessible as possible. And of course, accessibility means different things to different people, especially when we're dealing with a diverse user base. And because there's not one definition, there's not one checklist of what I can do to make this accessible. And if you see something that says my content is 100% accessible, then it should make you a little bit curious about what that means, because there's not really any way to make things 100% accessible, because that probably means they have not tested things with real people, or they don't have a full grasp of what accessibility means. And it also means that there's not really a checklist, but there are a family of tests and a number of best practices. It also means it depends who you talk to. I was at a conference earlier this week, and there were a number of disabled people in the audience, and some of them spoke about what accessibility means to them. For some people, having things like image descriptions is the most important. For some people, having properly structured content is the most important aspect. So it, of course, also depends on the kind of content that they're consuming. So how do we get started? Here are a few links, and I'm not sure if these slides will be provided to you, but I hope so, because there are a lot of links in this slide deck. I mentioned before that the WAI is the W3C's Web Accessibility Initiative. They have a great list of how to get started. It helps you understand what the business case is for accessibility, and just helps you explore how it is that you can help understand how you can get started. And then, of course, there's the planning and managing web accessibility aspect of their getting started. ARIA is one of the specifications that helps the web become accessible. It helps ebooks become accessible. And this is where we get into the area of long-form content. ARIA was originally built for just interactive content. But many of us are creating long-form content that has a great deal of interactivity built in. If you are building, let's say, animations into your long-form content, or into any content for that matter, it is very important to make sure that that is accessible to all users. Drag and drop, for example, is common in textbooks. That is not going to be something that a blind user can naturally use unless you build in some coding that can make it accessible to all users. And that's where you would turn to the ARIA specification. The gold standard for how to make things accessible is what's known as WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. They were just updated last year to include information about mobile. And I'll include some examples of what WCAG explains in upcoming slides. Perhaps I should have switched WCAG and using ARIA and HTML because I'm jumping around a little bit. But the ARIA specification can be a little bit hard to follow. And there's a very useful document called Using ARIA and HTML to explain how it is that you can make your books accessible. And the EPUB accessibility database by the DAISY Consortium explains how it is that you can make your EPUBs accessible. And this, of course, is specifically for the world of books, and how it is that you can make your books accessible using information from ARIA, from just how to structure your HTML in a clear way, because one of the first steps to making your content accessible is structuring your content in a way that is navigable by assistive technology. So let's talk about how accessibility is defined. Often, for the most part, it's defined by organizations like the W3C. The web, ebooks, learning management systems, and all web-based content rely heavily on the guidelines that the W3C has created for the web. WCAG 2.1 is a set of guidelines, as I said before, identifying success criteria and techniques for making content accessible. And it's based on 4 principles: making sure your content is perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And WCAG is intentionally vague so that just about everything can fit into it. So let's talk about an example of WCAG. There's a guideline in the perceivable category that says that you should create content that can be presented in different ways without losing information or structure, which you can see from the link is the broad category of making it adaptable. And in the success criteria, one way to make sure you meet this, which is new to 2.1, which is the mobile part of it, it says content does not restrict its view and operation to a single display orientation, such as portrait or landscape, unless a specific display orientation is essential. So this is the example I mentioned earlier. I suspect we've all encountered frustrating experiences on our small screen phones where we've seen a table or perhaps an image that just doesn't fit on the phone unless you rotate it. And then perhaps we've encountered an experience where it just won't rotate. And so you're trying and trying to read it, but there's just no way to read it. So now in the newest version of WCAG, that would be deemed as inaccessible. And if you were doing an accessibility review, that would be a strike against you. And WCAG is broken into 3 categories, 3 levels of compliance, I should say. There's A, AA, and AAA. And AA compliance is what most legislation points to. That's the mid-level of compliance. AAA is not unachievable, but practically unachievable, and it's more seen as a goal, a lofty goal, than something that most organizations will attempt to comply with. So I would recommend that if you are laying out requirements for yourself, and you're looking at WCAG, you attempt to meet the AA requirements. And here's an example of compliance that some people may be familiar with, and this is relevant to print or digital content. Color contrast and sizing are relevant when just choosing a simple design. And the combination of the two is really meaningful. And there are many online tools for checking contrast and size. And you can see just from this simple example that the text on the left in both sizes, even though they're the same color, is relatively easy to read. And those both pass WCAG AA compliance. And I believe AAA compliance as well. The text on the right, the top text, is relatively small, but it does not pass AA compliance because the contrast is not sharp enough. The text on the bottom, because it is both bold and large, even though the contrast of the 2 colors is not spectacular, does pass AA compliance. But it's a fine line to cross. And I'm not sure at exactly what point in the sizing it passes that threshold, but you don't have to memorize this sort of information because you can use automated tools to check that. Another area is images. Images are meaningless to someone who can't see. And many readers are choosing to listen to books, whether they're audiobooks or using a tool like VoiceOver, which is built into many devices. Image descriptions provide detailed information about images to users. And there's something of an art to writing them because they have to provide actual information and it has to be completely unbiased. And it's important to figure out whether you can understand the full meaning of the content without the image when you're writing it. And if you can't, perhaps you should stop to think about whether that image really needs to be there. And if the caption fully describes an image, perhaps the caption is sufficient. And it might be annoying to the person listening to it to hear a caption as well as a description because it duplicates things. Some images require a simple alt text, which is a very short description, and some will require an additional extended description. And if you have questions about that, I'd be happy to answer it. You can also make your interactive content accessible. A lot of people are under the misguided, well, the term HTML5 is not a catch-all term for accessibility. HTML5 has somehow come to mean the combination of HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and accessibility to some people. But it's important to be aware that HTML5 is not accessible unless you make it accessible. Content structure, the sequence of content, and the addition of things like ARIA matters. When you're creating interactive content, or really any content for that matter, it's important to be aware of the way that you're making it. When you're working with vendors, it's important to ask for templates so that you can reproduce it. And it's probably better to avoid one-offs. A good example of this is question and answers, which are really a templated format, can be a reusable script. And the only change for that should be the text. This is also a more cost-effective way to make it. When you're interviewing vendors or when you're renewing contracts with vendors, it's a good idea to ask them if they comply with WCAG and if they use ARIA. If they're not familiar with those terms, it's a pretty big red flag. You can ask them how they perform their accessibility testing. And of course, you can test the content yourself. So let's talk now about resources and tools. So the tooling can be a little overwhelming. If you just do a quick search for accessibility tools, you'll be bombarded with choices, and not all of the choices are equal. So another useful resource from WAI is their list of easy checks. And this is a good way to get in the habit of testing using the guidelines that we've just talked about. There are formal evaluation tools. I've put two here, Axe and Wave. And using these automated tools will help you assess the level of accessibility that you've reached, and they'll give you some questions that you'll have to answer yourself. However, they won't get you all the way there. The automated tooling will probably get you about 30% of the way. It will force you to evaluate things like color contrast, whether your links are correct. And it will ask you questions about the types of image descriptions that you've put in. If you want to test with assistive technology, that's fantastic, but it's useful only if you know how to use it correctly. Just like any tool, if you're using it incorrectly, it will lead you down the wrong path. It's very helpful to test with users with disabilities. They will offer you really valuable insight. It's important to be aware that if you test just as with any user testing, you need to make sure that you have a diverse user base. Or you might bias yourself, let's say by testing with one blind user. And of course, it's important to read up on how to involve users. I've included a link here to a video that shows how it's actually a group of videos, how people with disabilities use the web. It's a very eye-opening set of videos just to familiarize yourself with exactly that. It will show you people using keyboard navigation, people using closed captioning, people navigating without hands, that sort of thing. If you've not seen this sort of thing in the past, it's worth taking a look at this set of videos. I started to mention automated testing. So there are numerous tools that check for WCAG compliance. And of course, they're useful. And again, they'll show you about 30% of your errors. I recently saw a blog post that was describing how useful these tools are. The Web Aim Checker, I think it was, did an automated scan of the top 1 million websites in the world, throwing out empty pages, just the home pages, and I believe the number was 98% of them failed WCAG AA compliance, which is an alarming number. And you'll find out a lot of useful information, things like well-structured tables, find out if your headings are navigable. A lot of people using assistive technology will navigate by heading, much the same way that sighted people do. I know that often when I get a reference book or a nonfiction book, instead of reading it cover to cover, I'll look through the table of contents or I'll flip through just to get an idea of the basic structure of books. That is something that is easy to do with assistive technology if the book is structured well. So you want to make sure that you're structuring your HTML in a way that enables the user to do that. So you want to make sure to use things like the proper HTML headings so that the user is able to do that. Many of these tools will even catch bad behavior. So if you put in something like alt equals image, technically that is valid alt text because there's text there, but the robotic tools that automatically check this can't know that that is absolutely useless. And some of these tools will alert you to that bad behavior. If you do alt equals blank, that tells the assistive technology that this is not a useful piece of information, and the assistive technology will simply skip it. And some of the automated checkers will say to you, did you mean to leave this blank? And there are many checklists out there, and they're not simple checklists. You're not just going to be able to say, yes, no, I did this, now I'm accessible. But it's a very good idea to take a look at these so that you get an idea of what's out there and what you need to be paying attention to. There are a number of tools. There are even tools that will write image descriptions for you. I've included an article here that compares some of the tools to see what is useful and how good they are. I've again included the link to the Way Easy Checks, links to Axe and Wave, which are tools for helping you work through the accessibility checking. There are some Chrome developer tools, including Google Lighthouse, which some of your developers may be familiar with because it also includes tools that are not just for accessibility, and a few other tools. And it's important to understand what your goals with accessibility are, because there are dozens of tools that exist. And maybe it's just worth taking a look at the sets of tools that are out there to decide which one is best for you. And I've started to mention the limits of tooling. But even if you are just using the automated tools, you'll start to catch about 25 to 30% of your errors. So it's a really good way to get started. And here's a list of helpful resources. It's not a complete list and it might look overwhelming, but this is a variety of articles, and some of them are even books. Some of them are specifications. If you would like to understand how screen readers work and how you get from a book or an HTML article to the world of assistive technology, that article Semantics to Screen Readers does a really good job. If you're trying to make somebody in your organization care a little bit more about accessibility, that business case link is a really useful one. And if you're just trying to get a little bit more familiar with the world of accessibility, that list of 3 links at the end is a really useful set of websites to explore. Thank you.
Tzviya, that was a fascinating discussion of the complexities that people face in trying to build in accessibility. And just recognizing that you're out on the road talking to different people and populations. Can you talk about what, in your estimation, represents the biggest challenge for content providers in moving forward to build in this type of accessibility? Is it a problem of finding the right staff to do it for them internally? Is it a problem of the expense that might be associated with additional coding? What tends to be the biggest barrier for a content provider?
So from my perspective at Wiley, right now, my challenge is the costs associated with it for internal education and ongoing education of our developers. A lot of the groups that I work with have, we'll call it a varying sense of accessibility, ranging from they were experts 3 years ago to they know that accessibility exists. So, Wiley's a pretty big company. So, our education group is pretty well informed about accessibility because it's truly not optional there. But
and which leads me to my next question for you, which is, if you are in a library and you are operating under that constraint that you are not permitted to expend resource dollars on something that's not accessible, are there tips or ways, any recommendations that you might be able to share with the libraries that would help them navigate that? Because I would imagine that unless you phrase the question just right, you may think you are getting an accessible product when, in point of fact, there are degrees of accessibility. Are there checklists that people can use? How can a customer properly know what it is they're getting?
So that's an excellent question that I did not address here, and I should definitely add a slide in about that. One of the things I've worked on over the past several years is accessibility metadata, which is now a part of schema.org. And we're working with various retailers and I hope libraries. I need to talk to my colleagues in the standards world about which libraries are involved, so that metadata about which aspects of accessibility are included in a product can be exposed to the user. So again, this is part of schema.org, so it can be in a book, it can be on a website, it can be included in anything that uses schema.org. And there are various fields, including just a free text field that's called an accessibility summary. And this way, the user knows exactly what they're getting into.
But there's no logo that would regularly appear on a content provider's platform that says, yes, this you can rest assured that this content is appropriately accessible.
So the Diagram Center, which is an accessibility organization out in California, is working on a certification to say this has passed certificate of an accessibility certification. They're just getting off the ground with that, and an organization such as a publisher needs to sign up with them. And the DAISY Consortium has been working with them to be the organization that certifies that. And one of the pieces of accessibility metadata is that the product is certified by a third-party organization. There's also something called a VPAT, a voluntary product accessibility. I never remember what the T stands for, which certainly in the education sector it's not a requirement. The V is for voluntary, but many universities and libraries will not acquire a product unless there's a third-party VPAT certifying accessibility. Well, it's not certifying accessibility. It's a very detailed document that goes through exactly which accessibility requirements are met.
Well, it sounds as if, while it's a very complex road to travel, it sounds as if there is awareness that people are trying to push our progress forward in terms of making the material available to anyone with a disability. Because as you point out, all of us experience disabilities at some point or another.
Yes, and I should also add that in the US, I'm not sure about outside the US, for students with certified disabilities, they can usually contact the Department of Special Services to receive accessible books. So organizations like the Access Tech Network will be able to get materials for students that are accessible, and they can get those services for free.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your generosity in sharing both your time and your expertise in this area.